So tonight we're going to hear from Linda Jack, and she's teaming up with Teresa Baker to tell us about Charles Young and his wife, Ada. But rather than doing their bio, I'm going to ask each one of them a question. When you get the microphone in your hand, I want you to tell us how you became interested in history. Okay? But before we do that,
Dan, I remember the other thing.
go ahead.
Both the 30-foot wheel and the Cornish pump are operating.
Oh, good. Okay. So we love those moving parts down there. Excellent. So how many of you have heard of Joel Osteen? He's a pastor at one of those mega churches in Texas. Church that seats 50,000 people. I listen to him occasionally on Sirius Radio, and I like how he always starts his sermons by saying, "I like to start with a joke." I thought maybe tonight I'd start with the joke here. So maybe some of you have heard the saying in Al-Anon or AA, what we call the serenity prayer. And it goes like this: God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I have a post-it on my desk. I'm going to read that every day. I like that saying. Well, there's a new one out. They've kind of rebooted and upgraded like Windows does every couple of years. So there's a new one just for us seniors. It goes like this: the senility prayer. Grant me the senility to forget the people I never liked anyway, and the good fortune to run into the ones I do, and the eyesight to tell the difference. And then who's going to start?
Good evening. Thanks for coming out. I know it's kind of a crazy week with all sorts of stuff going on, and Chris is over at the Railroad Museum having a wonderful talk that I wish I could teleport myself and be in two places at once. But I would like to first thank you for coming, and second to Dan's question, sort of leads us to something Teresa and I have talked about. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a second. But the question is, how did this woman behind us, Ada Mills Young, come into our lives? And for me, I had a call from Susan Anderson, the historical curator at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. She was going to be doing an exhibit on the Buffalo Soldiers, and said, by the way, I think one of them, Charles Young's wife, was born in Grass Valley. What do you know about her? And I said, not a whole lot, but I'll get on it. And 3 years later, here we are. So I'm going to introduce Teresa Baker and let her have kind of the same question asked to her.
Thanks, Linda. Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Baker, and I have been a resident here in Nevada County for all of 8 months. So I don't know a whole lot, or let me say this: I didn't know a whole lot coming into this county. I knew absolutely nothing about the area other than the Film Fest, and that's what initially brought me here. History has always been a part of my life. Being from the Bay Area, I have been introduced to so many historical figures, and it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I was introduced to the Buffalo Soldiers. And I was shocked, the history that I learned right in my own backyard. There are over 400 Buffalo Soldiers laid to rest at the Presidio, San Francisco. And that was something I did not know. And when I started learning about that, I'm like, what else is hidden from me? So that is what piqued my interest around history.
So Teresa came into Cyril's and we got to chatting, and once we realized we had this common thread, here we are. So what I would like to start out with is just to say that we're going to go back and forth and keep this a little bit informal. We'll have questions at the end, but if you've got a dying need to have a question answered, feel free to ask it. So when you're looking at historical figures in the 19th and 20th century, especially women, you find that they're all pretty much under the shadow of their husband, father, brother, or all of the above. And their stories just don't get told. And so when we started looking, Teresa already knew quite a bit about Charles Young, who you'll find out was to be Ada's husband, but very little about Ada. So we decided to zero in on her and found really an amazing story. So I'd like to just say that when I first saw this photo, I was pretty captivated. Kind of hard not to look at that young woman and wonder about her. We believe this photograph was about 1903, so just about the time she was married, but no, we don't know one way or the other whether this was actually associated with the wedding. So next slide again, please. So Ada had a pretty rough start in life. She had essentially 3 families in her life. She was born to a woman named Nanny Burroughs. Nanny was born to 2 formerly enslaved people, Mary Burroughs and William Burroughs. William was an escaped slave and went into the Union Army. He was with the U.S. colored troops and fought in the South, but mostly in Texas, and was very likely, his regiment was one of the regiments that fought the very last battle of the Civil War in Texas before the last Confederate surrendered there. He, however, died in 1880 and left his wife, Mary, a widow with 7 children. We don't know exactly when Mary got to California, but she did find herself in Marysville with her children. Eventually, she got her husband's pension, his military pension, but not until 17 years after his death. And we do know that she had difficulties financially and a couple of times appealed to local sources for what they would call half-orphan subsidies to help her get by. So they lived in Marysville, and at some point in June of 1906, we think that Nanny got ill because she was dead by August. But in June, she made a will, and one of the things she asked was that her daughter, or granddaughter, who would be Ada, wasn't at the moment, would take care of her mother, Mary, which Ada did for the rest of her life. So next slide, please, Dan. So when Nanny was 18, she married a man named Edward Mills Jr. Edward lived with his parents, Jane and Edward Mills, on Townsend Street in Grass Valley. The Mills had come to California quite early. I believe they were probably part of the Kentucky Ridge slave cohort, in that Jane's children, 2 of Jane's children were born in Florida before they came to California. So that anytime I see a Florida person, I tend to think they came with that group. Jane and Edward Mills were the most respectable of people. They were part of the AME Church in Grass Valley, and they were, as one article called them, ardent supporters of the Salvation Army. This is an early photo of Grass Valley's Salvation Army, and the 2 little orange arrows are pointing to the people that we think are Jane and Edward Mills. So they were exceedingly respectable people. Their son, Edward Jr., who married Nanny Burroughs, was not. And he created an enormous scandal when he took up with a white woman in Marysville, had a child with her, abandoned his own wife and daughter, Ada, who was born in 1880 in Grass Valley, and created a scandal that went from Sacramento to Oroville and was covered by all the local newspapers. So poor Ada, being a child in the household of her grandparents, was subjected to this level of scandal. Next slide, please. Yeah. So Nanny, quite understandably, divorced Edward Jr. and married a man named Reuben Barr in Los Angeles. The Barrs were also from Missouri and had quite a collection of relatives in Marysville as well. So we don't know exactly what happened to Ada during these early years, but we do know that she quite mysteriously, next slide down, by 1893 had arrived at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. She was then only 13. So we don't know how she got there, but we do know that Spelman had been originally founded as a seminary for young black girls, young women and black girls, and they had a very rigorous educational program. And I do want to just read to you the curriculum because it was quite astounding to me. So if you did get to Spelman, what you would learn, what you would study would be algebra, physiology, essays, Latin, rhetoric, geometry, political economy, mental philosophy, which we would call psychology, chemistry, botany, the Constitution of the United States, astronomy, zoology, geology, moral philosophy, and evidence of Christianity, which I thought was an interesting subject. So we don't know how she got there, but she was there for 4 years, and certainly by the time she left Spelman in 1898 or 1897 or 8, she had acquired a liberal arts education that would certainly serve her well in her life to come. And in the 1990 census, she was back in Marysville giving a talk at the Lincoln commemoration and living with Arthur Barr, her uncle, probably Reuben Barr's father. So that we have now back in California. And about this time, she will be meeting and marrying a man named Charles Young. And we really decided that we don't want to try to recreate his life. So Dom or Dan, if you're ready, we're going to show you a little 10-minute film that the National Park Service did about Charles Young. And then when that film is over, Teresa's going to pick it up and talk a little bit further about Charles's life in California.
The year was 1864. The United States was mired in a costly and bloody civil war that had split the country over many issues, namely slavery. The Union was gaining traction on its momentum after the recent victory at Gettysburg in 1863, and as General William Tecumseh Sherman began his march to the sea.
Fathers brought forth on this continent.
1 year earlier, President Abraham Lincoln provoked both sides of the country with his announcement of emancipation, freeing all slaves in Confederate lands. However, slavery continued to thrive on the Confederacy side of the split country despite the paper proclamation from the Great Emancipator. Tucked away in the small Kentucky farming town of Mayslick, a child was born to an indentured couple in a small cabin. Charles Young entered the world on March 12, 1864. Despite being born to enslaved parents, which also made the infant Charles a slave himself, He would never have to experience the stifling degradation of being a slave, as he and his parents would make the short trek across the Ohio River into Ohio just a few short years after his birth. Charles Young's childhood began in the Ohio River town of Ripley. Raised by loving parents who valued and knew the importance of an education, he would excel in academics and vault to the top of his class by the time he graduated from the integrated high school in 1881 at age 17. Shortly after the conclusion of his secondary education, he was admitted to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1884. As only the 9th African American to enter the academy at that time, he would endure 5 long years of constant shunning and open discrimination from fellow students and faculty. Despite losing a year to a poor performance during his freshman or plebe year, he would overcome the obstacles and regain his academic composure to become only the 3rd African American at the time to earn his diploma and commission in 1889. 5 years later, in 1894, after serving with the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th Cavalry on the Western Plains in Nebraska and Utah, Young received a detached service assignment to report to Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio. Once there, he would teach the university's military science and tactics course, which prepared young African American men for future service in the military and in life as well. He quickly acclimated to the social and intellectual scene as he befriended many, including fellow teaching colleague W.E.B. Du Bois and notable black poet of the era, Paul Laurence Dunbar. The 3 of them would forge a friendship which lasted the rest of their lives. After the death of Young's father, Gabriel, in 1894, his mother would relocate to Wilberforce to live with her son as he began his teaching at Wilberforce University. Together, in 1907, they would purchase a house just west of the Wilberforce campus, which he would affectionately nickname Young's Home. The house would become the hub of social events around the university, and the Youngs always welcomed friends, family, and strangers alike. Despite his absences, Young's Home would remain the social hub of the university area and Young's permanent residence for the rest of his life. It was also the place where he could escape the harsh reality of the world by losing himself in his music and in his collection of books from around the world. Among the highlights of his stoic military career, he would lead troops heroically in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War, and years later in Mexico during the Punitive Expedition. In 1903, he would become the first African-American superintendent of a national park when he and his troopers of the 9th Cavalry managed the lands of Sequoia and General Grant National Parks in Northern California. The work that he and his men achieved that summer exceeded the total amount of work accomplished by the last 3 summer details of Army troops combined. Many of the roads and trails that he and his men constructed proved so sound that they are still in use today. In addition to being a decorated combat soldier, Young was also one of the first soldiers to be assigned as a military attaché in Haiti and Liberia. Building on the knowledge and construction experience from his days as a national park superintendent, he led workers in Liberia to develop and improve the nation's infrastructure. For his impressive and dedicated work in Liberia, Charles Young was awarded the NAACP Spingarn Medal in 1916, which is presented to an African American who demonstrates exceptional achievement and contributions in their field. Young would go on to serve the country with honor and distinction the rest of his life. Although being medically retired in 1917 for questionable medical reasons, he did not accept the decision and would go on to fight to be put back into active service. Late in 1918, after the war, he was placed back into active duty and then sent back to Liberia to resume his duties as an attaché. While on a field assignment that sent him into Nigeria, he took gravely ill and would succumb to a devastating kidney infection, dying on January 8, 1922. At the urging of his wife and other notable figures in society, Young's body was repatriated to the U.S. in 1923. He received a full military funeral, which included public street processions, culminating in a rare memorial service in the Arlington Memorial Amphitheater. Afterwards, Young would be buried in Arlington National Cemetery alongside the thousands of other heroes who share the solemn lands. In spite of the overt and egregious racism he would have to deal with throughout his life, Charles Young ascended through the military ranks to become one of the most respected leaders of his time. A well-rounded man, with a steadfast devotion to duty, he led by example and inspired generations of new leaders. Then and now, the legacy of Colonel Charles Young lives on. After several decades of lobbying and advocacy from family, friends, and supporters of Colonel Charles Young, Secretary of the Army, the Honorable Christine Wormuth, awarded Charles Young a posthumous promotion to Brigadier General on November 1, 2021. A few months later, on April 29, 2022, with members of the Young family in attendance, the United States Military Academy at West Point hosted a posthumous honorary ceremony to promote Colonel Young to Brigadier General. Long overdue, the promotion ensures that Charles Young will forever be known as General Charles Young. Learn more about Colonel Charles Young and the famed Buffalo Soldiers when you visit the park's website at www.nps.gov/CHYO and also on the park's social media web pages.
Before I turn it over to Teresa, I just want to just make a couple of comments. One, of course, is you see one picture, one reference to his wife, but she's not even named in this film, which is annoying. But I also want to say that although the film touched on the racism that he experienced, it really left out one of the most important aspects of that, and that is when he was forced out on medical leave, it was just before, or just at the beginning of World War I. And given his seniority, given his combat experience, he would have had, by any logic, gone into World War I as a commander of white forces. And that was unthinkable to the Army in 1914, 1915, and 1916. So I don't think there's any doubt that he was forced out on medical leave, so the Army did not have to deal with that unthinkable practice. And he was so outraged that he rode 500 miles on horseback from Ohio to Washington to prove his physical mettle, and unfortunately arrived, or fortunately, who knows, in Washington just 3 days before the armistice, so the Army never did have to deal with the issue of a black commander supervising white troops. So I don't know, I couldn't resist that one.
Awesome, thank you, Linda. One thing that I like to always share with audiences that I speak to is that I don't know all the pieces to any aspect of history. There's a quote that history will be good to us, for we shall write it. So with that understanding, I may say some things and someone may come behind me and say, oh no, that's not how it happened. But my hope is that there are people here or elsewhere who will speak up and say, well, here's a missing link. that you all aren't aware of. That's how we keep history relevant and how we can add to it where it's not so ugly, even though it is ugly. But we have to accept history as it was lived, not as it was rewritten. So, as I stated earlier, when I first started to hear about the Buffalo Soldiers in the Bay Area, it was 8 years ago that I connected with the National Park Service on his history, not only in California, but throughout the country and beyond. And I mentioned to the Park Service, we need to do something to honor this legacy. There are people here in California, there are people here in the Bay Area who have no idea that there are 400 Buffalo Soldiers laid to rest at the Presidio. So we did a gathering of Bay Area people, and there were probably 150 people who showed up for a conversation. And there were people who came up to us afterwards and said to us, I have relatives who are laid to rest right here at the Presidio, and I never knew it. Because there's a kiosk at the Presidio, and you can type in a name, and that name will come up if they are there. And it was then that I suggested to the National Park Service that we do something even bigger to honor the Buffalo Soldiers in California. And that was a retracing of the trail that the Buffalo Soldiers took from the Presidio to Yosemite. And I partnered with the National Park Service, I partnered with the Buffalo Soldier Motorcycle Club, and there were members from Hawaii that came to participate in that retracing. There were over 100 people with us. We were in buses, we were on motorcycles, we were in cars, and we traced the trail from the Presidio to Yosemite. And it took us approximately 6 hours, and only because we made stops along the way to honor the Buffalo Soldiers along the way. And once we got to Yosemite, Ranger Shelton Johnson, who does a lot of interpretation on the Buffalo Soldiers, said that it was the first time in his history at Yosemite that he had seen that many black people in Yosemite. And they were there to honor the legacy of Charles Young. With me on that trip was a guy named Robert Hanna. Robert Hanna is the great-great-grandson of John Muir, who happens to live here in Grass Valley. And after that retracing, Robert said to me, what can I do to upset the National Park Service? You have to understand Robert to understand that comment. Robert is a troublemaker to the highest degree. And even though his great-great-grandfather, John Muir, has a legacy in Yosemite, and that story is welcome, Robert Hanna is not welcome in Yosemite. So Robert also works at the Capitol in Sacramento. And he said to me, Teresa, let's rename the highway into Yosemite. Buffalo Soldier Memorial Highway. Oh, why did he do that? The National Park Service reached out to me and said, please speak with Robert. This is not the path we want to take. So I tried to talk to Robert, and Robert was like, nope, he got to do it. So we were able to rename the highway into Yosemite after the Buffalo Soldiers. I was like, good job, Robert. Calm down now. He was like, nope. And I said, okay, what can we do next? I was like, Robert, since you're all keen on upsetting the National Park Service, let's rename the highway into Sequoia. after Colonel Young. He was like, yeah. And 9 years ago, we started working on that. And it happened. And it was amazing to see descendants of Charles Young there with us, alongside the military, alongside the Department of the Interior, to honor this man and his legacy. And that, to me, will stand out the most, because it took Robert encouraging me to be just as deviant as him to make this happen. But I've had so many people come up to me since then to say, thank you for doing this. It's telling a story in California that they weren't aware of, and that's awesome. And then I moved here to Grass Valley. I'm not looking to rename any streets or anything. I'm not looking to do that. But when I got here, I had no idea that Ada was from Grass Valley. I was shocked. I was like, here's yet another piece of history that I'm not aware of. And when I spoke with Charles Young's great niece, and I said, were you aware that Ada is from Grass Valley? And she said to me, of course. I knew that. And she started telling me about Charles Young's tombstone and how Ada is buried there too. But they refused to put her name on the tombstone. And it wasn't just Ada. Any military women, wives, their names are not on the tombstones. And I thought that's an injustice that we need to stand up to. And she said, don't worry, Teresa, we took care of it. We fought, and her name is there now on the same tombstone as Charles Young. But there are so many other women throughout history who have settled under their husbands or any male figure. And that is an injustice to me. I don't care if you're black, white, it's an injustice to assume that the women in these men's lives who stayed back to raise the families aren't relevant enough to be added to tombstones, their final resting place. And that is what has captured my attention with Ada. Now that I'm here, I want to find out as much as I can about her time here in Nevada County. Yeah, that's what I want to continue to do. I want to learn about her kids and their kids, because they have to still be around. So my hope through this talk and what I'm learning through the Historical Society and with Linda is to continue to learn these stories, how they were, what they accomplished here, and through the help of people like yourselves, I will gather that information and I will take it back to Ada Mills and Charles Young's family and share that with them. And reach out to the folks at the Presidio of San Francisco and share it with them. Presidio in Monterey is another piece of history. There are 3 Buffalo soldiers laid to rest at the Presidio of Monterey. It took me 3 years to get permission to go there because it's an active military site. I was not allowed to take any photographs. They sent me photographs, but the Buffalo soldiers that built those barracks that are still in existence today, the Buffalo soldiers were not allowed to live in them because they were not allowed to share the same living quarters as the white officers. So they were pushed aside next to an amazing location in Monterey, right next to the aquarium. So they have this amazing space. But it wasn't just African Americans who weren't allowed to live on base, it was the Chinese as well. So they both shared this amazing space next to the aquarium in Monterey. But they built the barracks that officers lived in then and now, and they were not allowed to be there with them. So it's stories like that that angers me, but also excites me. And it's only driving me to learn more about that type of history. And again, thanks to Linda for having me here and for sharing and doing all the work she's done to uplift these stories of community members who otherwise may have gone unnoticed. So, sure. And I totally went off script, so.
Okay, so we're going to get back to Ada now. But it's important to, yeah. Oh, the Buffalo Soldiers were the 9th and 10th Cavalry units. They fought largely on the plains during the later part of the Indian Wars. They were came by that name, they think, because either they wore buffalo robes, and there are a lot of photos of these soldiers in buffalo robes, or because their hair reminded the native people of the buffalo coats. And so that's how they sort of came by those names, and I think both stories are still floating around. But they were, after the Plains Wars, they also were in the punitive expedition. That's what they called it when they went after Pancho Villa in Mexico. They fought in the Philippines, and virtually all of the wars during that later part of the 20th century. They had black officers like Captain Young, but the actual regimental heads were always white. So even when the cavalry soldiers were, say, at Camp Duchesne or Fort Huachuca, they had a white officer over them, even though the captains and the colonels could be African American. So, okay. Next slide, Dan. So one just more little local bit about, or Northern California bit about Charles Young is I found this rather surprising thing, that he had been the keynote speaker at the Student Assembly at Stanford University in 1903. And he spoke on the importance of how the country should treat race, and asked his audience to say, will you give it? That is, give the Negro the same opportunities as the white man. I've yet to find out how he got invited, but I have my former Stanford colleagues working on it. So, next slide. All right, so returning back to Ada's story, she and Charles Young were married in 1904. He was then a captain at the Presidio, and apparently a group of his unit went to visit him in his quarters one morning in February and were surprised to find a young lady at the door. So, but the scandal was soon put to rest because they had married the night before at her aunt's home in Oakland. She was 23, Charles was 39. We don't know exactly how they met, but she was reported to be have a role in the civil rights activities in San Francisco at the time. So however they met, they married quickly but respectably, and were installed at his officers' quarters at the Presidio. Go ahead, Dan, please. So almost immediately, she began deploying with her husband, and they went to a number of different places. I think I have the chronology here somewhere. Their first assignment was actually to Haiti, and Santo Domingo. And when they first got there, fairly early on in their stay, she had a miscarriage. So when she became pregnant again, she went home to Ohio to have their son, Charles Noel, and he stayed on in Haiti. They also deployed to Camp McGrath in the Philippines, which you see on the right. And then after that, talk about a difference in landscapes, Fort Russell, Wyoming, which was a hot and empty and dusty place that you see on the left. And when they were at Fort Russell, Ada had honored her mother's wish about her grandmother, and Mary Burroughs was with them at Camp Russell in the officers' quarters there. In 1912 and 1915, they were deployed to Nigeria, where, Liberia, where Charles was a military attaché at the capital of Monrovia. And there they had a large social presence. Liberia was a state that was formed by former slaves from the U.S. And of course there were indigenous people in that part of Africa when they arrived, so there was some conflict in the American former slaves' arrival. But Charles was tasked with building roads and infrastructure for this new country of Liberia. And Ada was a real partner in that role, and she would be known and loved and respected for decades afterward for traveling with him all over the country to give aid and assistance to people in the country. In 1951, she would go back as an honored guest, which I'll speak of in a bit. So eventually, and their daughter Marie was born in the Philippines. Next slide, Liam. But home was always this place called Young's Home. It was in Wilberforce, Ohio. Wilberforce University, as there it was the oldest African Americans built and owned higher college in the United States. Ohio was just over the river from Kentucky, so Young's Home, the house itself, had been on the Underground Railroad, and Wilberforce was a real center of black culture there. This is the house on the right, and the Youngs and some guests on the left. Next slide. As was mentioned in the film, W.E.B. Du Bois in the center, and his wife Nina had been teaching at Wilberforce, where they met Charles and Ada, and they were close, dear friends. The title of that film, A Triumph of Tragedy, that's a phrase that was taken from W.E.B. Du Bois when he wrote about Charles Young. And of course, Paul Laurence Dunbar, as you heard, and Langston Hughes, poets and writers, playwrights, were also their close friends. So it was a rich cultural setting. Charles spoke 5 languages, wrote music and poetry, and it must have been an oasis of culture in Jim Crow era America. Next slide. This is the family. I think you saw this picture in the film. So that is Charles Noel, named because he was born on Christmas Day, and Marie, their 2 children. Next slide. And one of the interesting things about the family was that when they were in deployment outside the States, and once the children were school age, they were put in boarding schools in Belgium and France while their parents were in these less than hospitable settings. And so the children got extremely cosmopolitan education, and I don't know if you can see the details, but this really cracked me up. This was a letter from Charles Noel to his mother. So even though they were in boarding schools, they seemed to have a rather jolly, affectionate relationship. The one on the left, those are cupids, and it's 50,000 kisses and either 50 or 500 million hugs. I can't make out how many zeros. And then on the right, that's a picture of his sister. He's complaining about her and how she's curling her hair. And other remarks are that he just now has long pants, and although he doesn't like them, he's able to run in them, so it's not so bad. So, you know, clearly this is just a sample, but he and his mother at least had a pretty affectionate relationship in spite of the distances. Next slide. And these are their two children, Charles Noel as an adult and Marie as an adult. Both were extremely accomplished. When they finished when they went to get their advanced educations, they returned to the U.S. And Charles studied agriculture and taught foreign languages at Central State University, and Marie graduated from both Wittenberg University and Catholic University, and she taught music and was the head of the music department at Wilberforce when she retired. She did marry and had one daughter, and Charles did not marry. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about Ada in some detail now. Charles died. When Charles died, she would go into 32-year-long widowhood. So she was widowed a lot longer than she was married, and she would actually have a rich life after that. She got the news that Charles had died when she was home alone. Immediately, sympathy telegrams and other information came pouring in. This one from the 10th Cavalry at Fort Huachuca, which is one of the units that Charles had served in. And she began immediately to try to bring his body home. He had been given a full military burial in Liberia, or in Liberia. He was actually in Nigeria when he died, but she wanted to bring him home. And it took, till June of 1923, almost a year before he could come home, but she did bring him home. Next slide. So I'd like to talk about Ada in more detail now, about what she did with her life in addition to deploying around the country and being both the hostess and managing the farm at Wilberforce when Charles was not there. So I'd like to talk a little bit about her life there. As I mentioned, she was a teacher. She taught at Central State University, which is also nearby, for over 28 years. She was very active in a lot of local activities, friendship clubs, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, so non-drinker for sure. She also traveled extensively. She, if you look at her immigration record, she goes back and forth across the Atlantic often, frequently. And she was a mentor to students for years. She was called the mother of the Pi Psi fraternity, which was the fraternity that Charles had been part of. And I think she was so well regarded, as I mentioned, that in 1951, when William Tubman was inaugurated as the president of Liberia, wasn't his first term. He was been the president of Liberia a long time, but she was invited to be the guest of honor to return to Liberia in thanks for all of the services that she had provided to the Liberian people when she was there. On her way home, she stopped in Portugal, France, and Spain to visit with friends. She was then 71, so may have not thought she would have the opportunity to visit with those folks again. So I think in her obituary, she is described as having an abundant life, which I think she surely must have. She raised 2 cosmopolitan children, taught, mentored, and she was remembered for her affability, her kindness, and her wisdom. So all in all, we wanted to be sure that Ada got some credit, not only at the time she died, but here in her hometown. So I'm going to turn it back to Teresa. A few things happened after Ada and Charles both passed. And I think Teresa's mentioned a little bit about some of them, but you might just do a little sum up about what happened after the fact. Next slide there.
As mentioned earlier in the film and through comments made by Linda, a couple of things took place after the passing of Ada. One of which was at Arlington National Cemetery, where her name was added to the tombstone. When in 2021, when Colonel Charles Young was promoted to General Charles Young, Brigadier Charles Young, in 2021, and his great niece, who is pictured here in the middle, was there to accept that honor in his name. And that took years to happen. There were people fighting for that for at least 15 years that I'm aware of until it happened. And then again, the naming of a segment of the park in Sequoia. The fact that all of this took place years after their passing, it's surprising that it took so much, but that is part of the legacy that the two of them, that Charles and Ada, share. You have to remember that when Charles was fighting for this country, all African American soldiers were paid literally $10 a month for their services. All other soldiers, not that much more. They were paid $13 a month. So understanding that at the time Charles had options: remain a sharecropper and make $3 a month, or work in the military. Those were his options, as well as a lot of the other African American soldiers of that era. So the fact that they had to fight so long to get these recognitions speaks to how strong people wanted to hold on to those ties to racism in this country. I'm happy that I'm here in Grass Valley to learn more about Ada Mills. I want to make sure that she doesn't just continue to sit under Charles Young and all of his accomplishments. I am going to fight alongside other people to find out, where are her great-grandkids? Are they still here? And try and find out what information they can share to tie some of these pieces that we aren't sure about. How can we get in touch with them and continue to tell this story? That's the importance of why we wanted to do this. So if there are people here that can point me in the direction of additional information, if I have misspoken about anything, please let me know. That's the only way we can continue to get these stories correct. I'm not sure if you all are aware of the Port Chicago incident that took place so many years ago. They were just this week acknowledged by the Navy in the fight that so many people have tried to make sure that their legacy will remain intact and that the stories told by them as being responsible for the explosion that took place at Port Chicago, which is near Concord, California. Over 100 soldiers were tried and convicted. And now, all these years later, just this week, were cleared by the U.S. Navy. And that's why it's important that we continue to tell these stories and uncover pieces of history so that we can get it right moving forward. Linda, I'll let Linda take some time to close it out, but thank you all for being here and listening to the story of amazing Ada Mills.
I just have
Go
one
ahead.
question on this. Renata Young, where is she? And
Yeah, Renata Young is the great niece of Charles Young. And I forget what state she's in, but she is part of the Charles Young Memorial Organization, and they help to tell these stories as well. But yeah, she's his great niece.
Yeah, I think one thing that we want to do is spell out more of Ada's life before she disappeared to Spelman, figure out how on earth this child got 5,000 miles away and enrolled at Spelman. And so there's a lot of parts of this story that we still want to explore. Their house, the house that she was born in, at the time the lot went from Townsend through to Pleasant Street, or from Townsend through to Pleasant Street. And so one possibility might be that we do a landmark to honor her birthplace. And also, if anybody's got an attic with a bunch of letters from Ada to anybody, please bring them out. We'd love to have them. And otherwise, just if anybody knows that area of town, on some census, the house is on Pleasant Street. On some census records, it's on Townsend. So I think it's because the lot went through the block. So if anybody knows anything about that part of town, there were other African Americans living in that area, the Sanks family, the Thomas family, right there on Pleasant, Townsend, and Walsh, that area. So anybody knows anything about that part of town, we'd love to hear it. Any questions? Yes.
I just have a question about her, I guess I'm confused, college at 13?
I'm sorry.
College, she went off?
Yes.
Calling it college, and she's 13.
Yeah, okay, so Spelman was originally founded as the Georgia Baptist Seminary. That's well before the Civil War, by two abolition women. Later, two other Northern abolition women, the Spelman sisters, got interested in the school. It was still a seminary by name. And one of the sisters happened to be married to John D. Rockefeller. So they got an enormous influx of funds. And at that point, were positioning themselves to become a college, a formal university level. But even before then, if you, by that list of topics that they were teaching, these girls were getting extraordinary liberal arts educations. And so Ada was there roughly between the time she was 13 and 18, and then returned to California. But again, we have no idea how she got there. Does that answer your question?
But they just must have been smarter back then.
Anything else? Yes.
When Colonel Young moved to Yosemite, the Buffalo soldiers did more than just patrol it. They kept it safe. They built roads. They drove the sheep, the illegal shepherds, sheep out, and they, in essence, were the law enforcement.
I think that's absolutely correct. Is that correct,
Right.
Teresa? That,
Right.
yeah, they kept poachers out of the park. They went up against the ranchers who tried to sneak their cattle in to graze in the park. So in addition to the road building and the other infrastructure, they were indeed policing the parks in those early years. I guess
It was a state park then. It
Yeah.
wasn't even a national park.
first a state park and then a national park.
It
Yeah.
was, Yosemite was the first state park, because it was a state park grant.
Right. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And there's going to be plenty of goodies over there.